Today we are starting our first unit called Pre-Modern Africa. This is going to talk about African history, starting in prehistoric times, getting all the way to the year 1500. So we're going to get all the way to the end of the Middle Ages in Africa, and today we are focusing on prehistoric Africa and ancient Egypt. So before we get started here, I just want you to pause the video real quick and just think about this question. What do you know about Africa today? Maybe write down 5 things. Think of 5 things in your head that you know about Africa. Well, here's some quick facts. There are 54 countries in Africa. There are over 200 distinct African languages. There are 1.3 billion people on the continent, which is 15% of the world's population. The northern half of the continent is mostly Muslim, and then Central and Southern Africa is mostly Christian. About 5 to 10% of Africans follow an animist or tribal religion. You also have the longest river in the world, the largest desert in the world, largest lake, and second largest lake, and one of the tallest mountains in the world. Okay, so that's obviously the Nile River, the Sahara Desert, Lake Victoria, and Mount Kilimanjaro. So what do you know about African history? Maybe pause again and think, what do I know about events of the past in Africa? You know, a lot of times we don't talk about that in world history class. A lot of times we just mostly focus on Europe. And while there's a lot to learn about European history that's really important to learn, Africa is important as well, and there's a lot of important things that happen there that most people do not learn about. So we're going to start with prehistoric Africa here. Some historians consider Africa to be the oldest inhabited territory on Earth. Now, the first humans in Africa were hunter-gatherers. Another word for that is hunter-foragers. That means they did not farm. They traveled, they were nomadic, and they would travel, follow the animals, right, and whatever they could gather to eat. The phrase out of Africa, this is known as the migration of humans from Africa to the rest of the world. So if you look at that map there, where all of those arrows are going from Central Africa to the rest of the world, that is known as the out of Africa migration, and how all of Europe and Asia was populated by the migration of Africans. There's evidence of early human presence. It's found in pretty much every part of Africa, including the Sahara Desert. There are some people who actually lived in that very harsh climate. We have artifacts from many thousands of years ago. In African hunter-gatherer societies, you had something called kinship groups. Okay? These kinship groups were formed, and they were basically several related families that would form. Okay, so you'd have like 5 or 6 families. They would come together and form a kinship group, and they would move together in search of food. Okay, that's called being nomads, called being nomadic. And these nomadic groups were part of larger groups of relatives called clans. Okay, and sometimes multiple clans combined to form a tribe. So that's what those terms mean. Okay, tribe is the biggest, clans are smaller, and kinship groups are even smaller than that. The major religion in Africa before the birth of Christianity was animism. Animism is the belief that things like animals, rivers, and other elements of nature embody spirits. All right, and that took many forms. Okay, the kind of tribal religions you think of today, trying to please the gods of every element. That is what was native to Africa. The Neolithic Revolution is also known as the agricultural revolution. And this caused population growth. When people learned how to farm, this replaced hunter-gatherer societies with civilizations based on agriculture because it was much more reliable. You knew that you would have a crop of wheat by the end of the season, whereas you couldn't guarantee that the herd of zebra that you're following would always remain populated. Okay, so the Neolithic Revolution brought a lot of change, and you have the first ever civilization starting to form in permanent locations where they stayed. So one of the first ever permanent locations, civilizations in Africa, was of course ancient Egypt. It's located right here today. Egypt is a country today, and ancient Egypt kind of looked like this. It was all along the Nile River. And that was one of the first civilizations to form in Africa. So ancient Egyptian civilization was formed around 3000 BC. That's over 5,000 years ago. And it lasted until 332 BC when it was conquered by Alexander the Great. We'll talk about him more next class. But that is an insanely long time to exist as one civilization. That's 2,700 years. Now, that is more than 10 times the duration of the United States. Okay, so this existed for a very long time, and its culture was largely consistent. The foundation of ancient Egyptian civilization was the Nile River. No Nile, no Egypt. Everything was based off of the Nile River. It flooded predictably. This was huge. Now, these days we see floods exclusively as a bad thing. But back then, especially if you could predict it, floods were a good thing because they would bring silt, okay, the kind of fertile, nutrient-rich sediment from the riverbeds up to the plains that would be farmed. Okay, so the Nile River Valley had perhaps the most fertile soil in the world at the time. The Nile was very easily tamed for something called basin irrigation, where they would draw the water from the river to their farms. And this was great for agriculture. The Nile was also very slow-moving and navigable, very easy to sail up and down the Nile River, which was great for trading and connected Egypt with other civilizations in the region. So the Nile River shaped ancient Egyptian culture in every possible way. It even shaped their religion and their governments. Since the Nile was the source of the people's existence, they kind of saw the river as similar to the gods. All Egyptian gods had to exhibit the characteristics of the Nile to be, very predictable, calm, good to their people, okay, beneficial. And a lot of the Egyptian gods related to blessings of agriculture. So, for example, Ra was the god of sun and of creation. A lot of it had to do with the Nile. Also, Egyptian pharaohs, okay, the kind of kings of ancient Egypt, were seen as like half man, half god. And they were believed to become gods upon their death and were also expected to act like gods on earth, which meant acting like the Nile, being the kind of calm, predictable, benevolent, good to your people, just like the Nile was. Ancient Egyptian history is divided into 3 eras. You don't have to memorize these dates, okay, but just to give you kind of a framework about what we're talking about, you have Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom. The Old Kingdom lasted around 500 years, okay, from 2649 BC to 2152 BC. All right, then there was a short break. Then you have the Middle Kingdom, which lasted 400 years, and after another short break, you have the New Kingdom, which lasted 500 years. Okay, the 300 or so years before the Old Kingdom, we know very little about because there was no written language then. And the time after the New Kingdom, but before Alexander's conquest, Egypt had become much less of a world power, so we don't categorize it as the New Kingdom, and Egypt was very powerful in all 3 of these eras. The most lasting monuments in Egypt were built during the Old Kingdom, and that, of course, was the pyramids. Okay, here you see the pyramids at Giza. There are dozens of pyramids throughout Egypt. These, of course, are the most famous, with the tall one, the Great Pyramid, being the only one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world that is still standing. All other 6 have been crumbled or destroyed. So the pyramids were built around 2500 BC. Okay, they were the Great Pyramid right there that you see, that was the tallest building in the world for 4,000 years, over 4,000 years. And when you think of Egypt, a lot of people think of the pyramids. Okay, a lot of people think of the Old Kingdom. You also have things like the Sphinx that was built during the Old Kingdom. A lot of these lasting monuments were Old Kingdom creations. Now, these amazing structures were built both by peasants who were paid, often in things like grain, but it was also built by slaves. The construction methods, however, are a complete mystery. Okay, it's just incredibly impressive, seeing as they did not have modern technology. How did they cut each brick? How did they get them all there? How did they get them to the top of the pyramid? I mean, it's just so incredibly impressive. There's a really cool documentary called Naked Science on the pyramids that goes over theories as to just how they did it. Another thing about Egypt is that cats were believed to have divine power. They were obsessed over, and they were sometimes even worshipped. It's always really interesting to me to figure out what animals certain cultures obsess over. It's always different depending on what part of the world you're in. Hieroglyphics, all right? Hieroglyphics was a pictorial form of writing that was developed during Old Kingdom Egypt. It had around 1,000 characters, all right? Here in English, what we speak is only 26 characters, so think about having that many characters in your alphabet. So some hieroglyphics represented letters, some represented syllables, and others represented entire words, so that's why there were so many of them. Now, very few people in ancient Egypt were literate, so only the very upper class of people could read and write hieroglyphics. And that was typical in most ancient societies. What made the Old Kingdom really stand out from the two later kingdoms was its incredible wealth. Okay, it was unbelievably rich, one of the richest civilizations in the history of the world, and it was mostly due to the Nile. Okay, without the Nile, not only would they not have been wealthy, but they would not have really existed. But because of the Nile, okay, you had great agriculture and you could trade on it. Okay, so that really gave them a lot of wealth. However, there were a series of droughts that came in the 2100s BC. This caused severe famine and the decline of the Old Kingdom. So there was a brief intermediary period, but then the droughts ended and Egypt was restored. This looked a little bit different. The line of pharaohs was restored, and while Egypt was never again as wealthy or powerful as they had been during the Old Kingdom, they still once again rose to prominence and as a world power. Aside from the difference in wealth, there were a couple other differences between Middle and Old Kingdom Egypt. First off, the religion was a little bit different. Now, it was still polytheistic, which means many gods. They still had some of the same gods, but the Middle Kingdom had a religion with a different pantheon of gods. They added other ones. Okay, they combined Old Kingdom gods with Middle Kingdom gods to create a new pantheon. So, for example, the sun god Ra was combined with the god Amun to make Amun-Ra. If you've ever seen Night at the Museum, that was a character in that. But this remained the god of creation throughout the Middle and New Kingdoms. The religion basically remained unchanged after this point. The Hyksos. Right? The Hyksos were very significant historically for a number of reasons. They changed Egyptian civilization and also impacted future civilizations. How'd they do that? Well, they took over Egypt. How do you take over one of the most powerful civilizations in the world? You have something they don't that you use in battle. And what the Hyksos had that the Egyptians did not have to use in battle was horses. Okay, they were the first people to ever use horses in battle, and that's how they were so successful militarily. Okay. Horses remained an integral part of military strategy for the next 4,000 years or so, all right, all the way to the beginning of the 20th century. Just like 120 years ago, you still had a lot of people using horses in battle, and it was just a huge advantage that you had because they were fast, they were strong, and you were higher up, all right? So they were a huge advantage. That's how the Hyksos were able to conquer Egypt. However, instead of forcing the Egyptians to assimilate to their culture, instead, the Hyksos assimilated to their culture, which is very unusual historically as well. Okay, but the Hyksos and the horses both start with H, easy to remember. That's something you really have to kind of internalize here, that they changed world history. I mean, all the way up to people like Napoleon, okay, rode a horse. George Washington rode a horse. Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, they rode horses, and it all started back with the Hyksos 4,000 years ago. After another brief intermediary period, the New Kingdom rose to prominence. And the New Kingdom, obviously the most recent one, and this is the one that has a lot of the famous pharaohs. Okay, for example, Ramses, if you've ever heard of him, he was during the New Kingdom. One of the most important pharaohs of the New Kingdom was named Hatshepsut. She was a woman. Okay, I've got some female history here. Hatshepsut was one of the only female pharaohs in Egyptian history. You probably know the name of another female pharaoh, Cleopatra. But they were some of the only ones. And Hatshepsut's greatest contribution was the expansion of the kingdom, not through conquest, but through trade. She said we need to keep Egypt relatively small geographically, because when nations get too big, they're very hard to govern, which is absolutely correct. That's why the Roman Empire fell. It got too big to govern. So by keeping Egypt relatively small and well connected through trade, it was able to remain a world power for centuries. Also, a very well-known event took place during the New Kingdom. If you've ever read the book of Exodus, you know about the Israelite enslavement in Egypt. Okay, this did really happen. It took place during the New Kingdom. The Israelites were in Egypt for several centuries, about 400 years during the New Kingdom. And then they left Egypt for Canaan in what became known as the Exodus, which means departure. Okay, there you see paintings, wall paintings of the Israelites as slaves in Egypt. Now, there is one myth about the Israelites' enslavement in Egypt, and a lot of people say, oh, they're the ones who built the pyramids. It's actually not true. The Israelites absolutely were slaves in Egypt, but remember, the pyramids were built during the Old Kingdom, right, more than 1,000 years before the Israelites came to Egypt. Okay, so the Exodus probably took place during the reign of Ramses II, around maybe about 3,500 years ago. Perhaps the most famous Egyptian pharaoh of all time is King Tut, right? King Tutankhamun. All right, you probably heard of him. He reigned in Egypt during the New Kingdom, but he died at the age of 19 in 1322 BC after reigning only 9 years as pharaoh. So if he only reigned for 9 years and he died when he was a teenager, why is he so incredibly famous? Well, he's famous because his grave was not robbed by people back then. It wasn't robbed by grave robbers, and therefore his legacy is preserved. His grave was discovered by British archaeologists in 1922, and it had been untouched for 3,000 years, unlike that of any other pharaoh. Okay, it was almost completely intact and preserved. It was a 4-room chamber discovered that contained thousands of just priceless artifacts that not only were very valuable and pretty, but they taught us a ton about ancient Egypt. So at this time in 1922, really throughout the rest of the 20th century, there's this renewed interest in Egypt because now we had all this new stuff to look at and learn about. And there were murals painted on the walls. There were oils, perfumes in his grave. You had toys from King Tut's childhood, bracelets, rings, golden statues, just a vast amount of wealth. And most importantly, his body was in there. The body of King Tut was found inside a stone sarcophagus that contained a golden coffin, and his mummy was intact. It had been preserved for over 3,000 years. The methods that the Egyptians used to preserve dead bodies through embalming and things like that were just incredibly effective. Now, these discoveries have traveled to 6 continents. They've taught us so much about Egypt, and as I said, really sparked a resurgence of interest in ancient Egypt and in ancient history in general among the public. All right, so that is prehistoric Africa and ancient Egypt.